The guy is like straight up. Sorry.
No, it helps me.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're back. And the first talk after the break is about how to build a DePIN protocol. And I've got Mustafa here from Volt Capital, who is doing research engineering at Volt Capital, and he'll be talking to us about DePIN protocols today.
Okay, good afternoon. So yeah, I'm do research at Volt Capital. Previously did research on EIP 1559 at the Ethereum Foundation, and then at Six Man Ventures before joining Volt. So I focus on DePIN. I focus on how to build better DePIN protocols because I think it's a very underexplored space. So yeah, let's talk about a big question: is DePIN dying? There's been a lot of FUD recently about this. And I think it's based on some of these metrics that you see. You know, like the multiples are pretty crazy. There's in aggregate $72 million of revenues compared to $10 billion in market cap. The revenues are low. They're not very consistent. They're kind of cyclical. In the case of things like Helium, they happen with kind of centralized partnerships, so it's outside of the decentralized models. And a lot of this FUD is just kind of insinuating that maybe this is a speculative bubble. This is not a way to build infrastructure. So we're going to kind of hone in on three critiques here. One is that inflationary tokens are not sustainable for building infrastructure. One is that DePIN is trying to build perpetual motion machines by kind of creating this network effect that will continue to kind of manifest itself and build on itself. And that verification of service when you go decentralized is an unsolved issue. So in order to better understand that, what I'd like to do is kind of zoom back out, talk about production systems, infrastructure systems in general, outside of a DePIN context, and then think through what happens when you decentralize and what the challenges are posed to protocol designers. Okay, so let's talk about infrastructure systems. So this is my framework to kind of think about the primitives of an infrastructure system. I think there's three inputs: capital, which is like the GPUs, the sensor, whatever the infrastructure is, those nodes. Operational effort, so that's maintenance, provisioning those nodes, electricity, the inputs to run those nodes, and then coordination, so like routing, load balancing, quality management, pricing, all those things are kind of the coordination layer. And obviously it all goes towards one output, which is service bought by users. I think DePINs decentralize the first two inputs. So instead of me as a centralized entity acquiring all this capital, I'm going to decentralize this to other people to bring their own capital, and they get a piece of the pie in exchange. That's kind of the idea, right? You may think that coordination should also be decentralized if you're talking about DePIN, but I think it's different. It's actually everybody's playing in one protocol, which is kind of set by a centralized entity. So I don't think that is a decentralized part of this. That's an input that remains somewhat centralized because the protocol designers, it's their task to design a good coordination system so that it actually works. And that's kind of like the point of what we're talking about today. So as a thought experiment, pretend you're in a pre-DePIN world and you have this idea, you want to be a founder, that you're going to build a competitor to Google Maps because the traffic data is just not accurate enough. So your idea is, what if we crowdsource people to bring in sensors, right? You can set up a sensor on your street or a highway near you or something. I don't know how safe that is, but in a way where we can get real-time accuracy. This is kind of like our thought process, and it's important to note, this is a pre-DePIN world, right? You just had this idea. Now we're going to think through, okay, how do I implement this? What are the challenges to do this? First thing you should ask is why, right? So in this vertical, DePINs are various, right? The verticals are different. In physical things, location-dependent things, one really important thing is geography. You want to be able to spread out and get as much infrastructure in many places as possible, right? So if you do this in a decentralized way, it sounds like a good idea, right? It's much easier to not have all that capital expenditure. You can bring those people in from different areas, and it's much easier to stand up that infrastructure. Risk also. If you're a centralized entity, you have one risk profile, and you need to manage your business in that way. With decentralization, you kind of open this risk aperture, right? And you have other people's varying risk profiles. That can be a great benefit too. It allows you to be a little bit more dynamic in the way that you can spread this infrastructure. And then the last is reactive supply. So in centralized models, if I have a bunch of infrastructure and nobody's using it, then I'm bleeding money. And that's just not a good thing. So in a decentralized market, the idea is that a market will kind of prune off excess supply, right? This is not real time, but that's kind of one idea that you might think is, oh, this is a beneficial aspect of going decentralized, right? But then we should think about what changes. So this is, I think, where we need to slow down, and a lot of protocols do not slow down and think about what are the new issues that are arising that we need to address in a DePIN protocol. So I have 4 listed here. Demand prediction, which basically the idea is when you decentralize and you want to put new infrastructure in places where there's new demand, you need to now publicly signal that to your nodes. And that needs to be priced in. That is not a trivial issue, right? That's a dynamic pricing issue. You need to figure out how to incentivize people to come to an area. That's a new issue that you need to solve. Bootstrapping, right? In the centralized model, it's simple. You raise capital, you go buy infrastructure, you deploy it, whatever. There's the cold start problem in DePIN, right? There's no supply, so nobody's going to come use your service, so there's not going to be anybody who wants to give you the supply, right? It's this chicken and egg problem that you need to address. This is one of the major issues that I think you can trace back to kind of the failures in DePIN. And then quality assurance, right? In a centralized entity, it's much easier to trust that the service being provided is of quality, right? The issue with the decentralized model is now each of your nodes is an adversary, and they can lie to you, and they can try to game you, and kind of make money off of you in kind of like a moral hazard way. So that's a new issue you need to work with, right? You have a game theoretic aspect of this business now. And then revenue distribution. So you have to figure out how to do pricing, how to reward people. It becomes part of this game, right? Back to this game theoretic idea. Now that you have adversaries, which are also your infrastructure, that's a much more complicated issue. So what we'll do is we'll go through these problems, we'll think of a way to solve it, and that will kind of give us requirements, right? And this gives us a structured way of thinking about what does a DePIN protocol actually need. So the first one, the question you're really asking is, when you're trying to incentivize demand in an area, say in our mapping protocol, we want, in some really high traffic area, we want more nodes there. There's not enough coverage. The question you ask is, what is the minimum premium I can pay operators so that enough of them come and I get enough coverage in this area? So that means we need to be able to track operator histories. We need to be able to track this data so that we can dynamically price these things and learn the best way to price this so that we can incentivize the right amount of people and not too many people and not enough people, right? We need enough capital or enough infrastructure in an area at any one time given the demand. So, there's plenty of ways to do that, but this is one of our requirements. The other one is solving the cold start. So we have to build out the supply first. I think a lot of people think it's a chicken and egg where, does demand come first or supply? I argue that you need to have supply first. It's very rare that you're going to have a DePIN where you're going to have a bunch of demand for a service that doesn't exist yet, right? So this is something that we need to figure out. We need to subsidize initial supply when there's no money coming into the network yet so that we can stand up an actual infrastructure network. This is also something that people just thought that tokens would solve. And we've kind of seen it doesn't do that for, I think, somewhat obvious reasons in hindsight. Quality assurance. So operators are now adversaries, as I said. We need to ensure that any bad behavior is not profitable and that you can punish people for doing bad things, so to avoid moral hazards. So without control over these individual people, we need some mechanism to verify that people are doing the work they're saying and that it's good quality work. Those are very important so that people who are using your users need this requirement. This is extremely important. And then revenue distribution. So there's a lot of questions that come with revenues. One thing is you'd probably want it to be global. So cross-border payments suck, they're slow. This is obviously hinting towards blockchain, but we need to be able to dynamically adjust revenue. We need to be able to do this globally and distribute it globally. Okay, so these are all those requirements listed. I'm not going to read them out, but this is what we just did. It was the ones in blue. Now we're going to say the first question, because remember, we're in a pre-DePIN world, can we do this without blockchains? So the first one, yeah, you can track operator histories with a database. That's not that hard, right? Subsidizing initial supply, we can raise capital to deploy, but that kind of kills this whole point of this decentralized thing. We wanted to not have to do that. So that doesn't really get solved without blockchains. We need something else. A mechanism to verify that work is done accurately. Well, we need to hire a QA team or introduce auditors into this, but now that's really much more complex. What are the auditors' incentives? How do we audit the auditors? This becomes an issue. And then dynamically adjust revenue splits and distribute them globally. That's an obvious issue with fiat payments. It's slow and expensive cross borders. Now, let's go to blockchains. What do blockchains solve? blockchain solves some of these problems, right? I think a lot of people assumed, because when you think about it, that, oh, blockchains, verify work, they do all these things, this is going to give us, the solution to all these issues. I think blockchains solve 2 out of these 4. The first one is tracking operator histories, natural place, it's a ledger, right? You can track how operators are performing, you can do public, easy to trust neutral pricing logic with smart contracts. Subsidized initial supply. This was, I think, the major assumption of most DePIN protocols in like their first phases is that tokens will solve this issue. They can inject speculative value into this, but you still don't have revenue. You need revenue. So that's still an issue that blockchains do not solve. Now, this next one, verifying that work is done accurately and that bad actors are punished, blockchains do not solve this for DePIN at all. Blockchains can verify the provision of blockchains themselves, but they cannot verify work done outside of the blockchain. So that's an issue you need to work with. And then dynamically adjusting revenues, tokens are a natural solution to that. So the 2 things that are left, generating demand. There's no easy answer here. This is something that we still need to figure out for DePIN, but a lot of it looks like centralized deals with institutional customers, building out that kind of demand. Go-to-market strategies, marketing, and on the supply side as well. We saw this with Helium, doing things with T-Mobile, AT&T. Those are the things that actually let Helium become a profitable, not profitable, but a revenue-generating protocol. Those are the kind of things that are required. Like I said, there's no easy way around the fact that you need to build these things first. And then verifying work. So this is a hard problem to solve in general. There's very recent academic research on incentive mechanisms that can solve this, but contrary to what you might read in white papers, there is no bulletproof way to verify work in any DePIN protocol live on chain right now. It might be resilient to a lot of attack vectors, but I will always be able to show you an attack vector that they cannot solve for. So why do DePINs ignore these issues? I think it's because we inherit these L1 primitives, right? L1 tokens secure consensus. They're used for pricing block space, which has a lot of demand, and the utility is directly related to the token or consensus. And I think speculation, which was kind of the flywheel effect that helped bootstrap these L1s, was great for bootstrapping liquidity. It doesn't do anything for infrastructure service, right? It just creates this other speculative bubble that doesn't have anything to do with the usage of your infrastructure or any revenues, right? So perpetual emissions make sense for L1s, but for DePIN, it doesn't really make much sense, right? So I think this is the issue of not inheriting these. Because it's building on blockchains, we assume that we can inherit all these primitives. A lot of these don't apply. This is a completely different thing. We're using the ledger for 2 out of 4 of those requirements, not all 4. So one way to think about this is like subsidy ratios, for example, which is the percent of the operator revenue that comes from emissions. A lot of the DePIN protocols right now have like standard set constant emissions. They're constantly inflating, similar to L1s. And that ends up being a huge part of how operators are being paid. I think that's obviously not a sustainable way to sustain infrastructure at all. You need to have revenues that are coming into this. So if you look at a ratio of those 2 things, how much of the provider payment is through emissions as opposed to revenues, then you can see it's pretty dire, right? Something like Filecoin is over 99%. The best performing here is Helium, due to the fact that these are as of Q4 2025. Helium, this dropped down pretty quickly because they had like $1.5 million of revenue in November of last year due to those AT&T and T-Mobile deals, because they actually had revenue. So this is one way to measure the health of a DePIN protocol and how it's tracking with building actual revenues. So I think what is the future of DePIN design? How do we fix these issues? I think demand responsive emissions is kind of, BME, which is burn and mint equilibrium, kind of hints towards this, but there's still constant inflation for no reason. Having something related to demand and related to revenues for emissions is the smart way to do this and the only sustainable way to do this. Staking for verification. Staking is a lot of times used for like a token sync, but I think when you do that for verification, and this is related to some research on peer prediction mechanisms and stuff on how to solve these issues in DePIN protocols. Staking can solve a lot of those issues for you. So that's one easy lift way to increase the quality assurance of a DePIN protocol. Dynamic burn. This is something that we kind of have seen a lot. Helium kind of led this, but this is still a great way to add some deflationary pressure to your token and continue building out a sustainable protocol. And then planning for growth. So once you reach that level where revenues are starting to sustain your infrastructure, you should change the way that your emissions work. No DePIN protocols actually have this written into their tokenomics. They have an infinitely inflating supply. So planning for that and rushing towards that as fast as possible is the best way to create a sustainable DePIN network. Because after that, you can change your tokenomics to actually accommodate the fact that you have revenues and you don't need to overinflate and create these really volatile pricing, token price actions. So, is DePIN dead? The answer is kind of, but hopefully we'll iterate, we'll come up with better designs, and we'll actually go towards sustainable infrastructure in the future. Thank you. I write about this on Twitter if you want to read with Volt Capital's research. Thank you.